Can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. I chose this picture because we went to a recent Halloween party, and I dressed as a zombie. So I was thinking like, hey, let's make a little bit of fun of this. Anyway, so today I want to talk about why your application is not your framework. And it always happens when I talk to developers about, hey, what are you building? You know, what's your application? And they start talking about, it's a Rails app, it uses some database, Oracle, PSQL, MySQL, whatever. We use ERB, we use Ember.js, we use Phoenix, we use Spring Framework, but they never tell me what the application actually is. And we're going like, I don't know. It's a Rails app, that's great, but somebody already invented that. You don't need to build Rails. What's your application all about? And it always happens that they talk about the framework and not the app. Anyways, I'm Enrique. I'm a software craftsman at 8light. 8light is a software consultancy. We take quality software very, very serious. The way we hire, for example, resonates with what Carlos was saying before. We have a modern apprenticeship where when you come into the company, you become an apprentice at first, and you go through an apprenticeship which can last up to a year, where you're just learning. You know, that's what you need to bring to the company. You need to learn, and you need to learn to become a good craftsman in order to pass your challenges and then become a craftsman at our company. Anyways, let's start. So, frameworks. Who has used any one of these? In anger. So, what is the great thing about the frameworks we use? Because actually frameworks are pretty sweet in a way. So they give us certain things, right? They give us convention. You follow some conventions about a framework, your life will be great. They offer some configuration points sometimes, always. They offer a way to standardize the way you build your software so that everybody can understand what you're doing and how you're doing it. New team members, if they understand the framework, chip in like that and know exactly where to work. And they speed up our development. There is a very interesting video, or there was, long ago, when Ruby on Rails became famous. There's this video of somebody creating a blog in about 5 minutes. And it was like, holy smokes, you know, how the hell did you do that? This is crazy, right? And it is quite crazy if you think about it. But there's some benefits about frameworks in general. And I'm going to talk first about the benefits, and then we're going to see if they're so beneficial at the end of the day. One thing about configuring all the conventions of your software is the fact that actually our software, like most of the time, most of the lifetime of our software is not in development. So when a framework has a standard way of working, has a convention of working, it will help us in the future. Because we will go back to what we did, we will understand it, and we can chip in, we can move forward. So we're going to maintain it quite easily. Well, that's what we think. So hardly any software is maintained by the original authors. We all know that, right? You look at a piece of code, and you go like, oh my god, I would have written it so much better. Right? And then you look a little bit further and go like, oh, I was the author. That can happen. That happens to me a lot. I look at code and I'm like, oh, who did this? And I go like, oh, it was me. Shit. Damn it. So some say it's actually a good thing, because as long as you have that reaction, it means you're learning. It means you're moving forward. And you see the code that you wrote before, which was pretty bad, so you keep on improving. It's a good thing. But because most of the time the author is not going to be you, but you, the maintainer, you want to actually see something that you can relate to, where you can simply chip in very quickly, see where what is, and change it. So coding conventions, or any conventions actually, improve the readability of the software. They improve the speed of the understanding, right? It's more about when I see a piece of software, is how quickly will I understand that software? How quickly can I be productive? So when I have conventions, that usually happens pretty quick. So well-packaged software. Again, every single framework you use, be it the Spring framework, be it Django, be it Phoenix, be it .NET or anything, has a certain way where the packages are structured, a certain way how the directories are structured. So if you're familiar with those things, it's going to be relatively easy for you to actually find your way. So all these things are really, really great when you talk about frameworks, because they give you these structure, this knowledge, this familiarity with the code that otherwise you wouldn't have, right? If we all wrote our own web servers, we all wrote our own application frameworks every single time, well, the learning curve would be ridiculous. Convention over configuration, we've heard that a lot. Now this is actually, this was coined by the Java Beans 1.1 specification. And it's even further than that. It comes by the notion of the default that we had in software long ago when we were writing C. So this is a notion that we actually know. It's something that frameworks have taken at heart, something that frameworks are doing right now. So instead of talking just about theory and about, hey, this is what frameworks give you, I'm going to go through examples. And I'm going to use a known framework for no other reason because it's easier to read. Why is it easier to read? There are less touch points. I will have to explain less things. So it's going to be a little bit easier to understand what I mean. So what is Ruby on Rails? Ruby on Rails is a framework that allows you to build web applications. It follows at least two patterns, the model view controller and active record. Apart from that, it's very heavy on convention over configuration. Who of you has actually used Rails, Ruby on Rails at some point? Okay, not many. Anyways, let's go through it. So imagine in Rails you can, if you think about this model view controller, you can define models. Models are objects that are linked to the database following the active record pattern, meaning that one object, let's go here, that one object of this type, of the type post, represents one row in the database, right? And if you make a select over many posts, you will have a collection of those, right? Then it has, I'm going to go back, whoops, I'm going to go back. Then it has views. The views is basically a templating system for HTML, where you will translate that, what you did in the controllers, will come in a moment, translate that so that you can send the HTML back to the browser or JSON or whatever. And then at the end you have the controllers, which is like any web controller, takes in a request that was given by a route to them, process it, calling the models, calling the view, and sending it back to the browser. All right. So the thing with Ruby on Rails has a lot of conventions. So this is the entire definition you need to actually do anything with a post. Save it, search for it, delete it, find it, do some weird SQL statements. All that are magic methods that are inherited from this thing called active record base. It's pretty magic. When you see it for the first time, you go like, what? Like there's something missing here, right? It feels strange at the start. When you start with it, it feels awesome. You know, suddenly you're like riding unicorns because you're like, whoa, this is amazing. But then you realize it's not that great. Anyways, then you have a controller. Here I've defined two methods. One is to list all the blog posts, and one is to show a particular one. So as you can see, I defined there with @posts, I'm defining a variable that will be sent over to the view that the view template can actually use. And I'm saying post.all, which is basically select from posts, like star from posts and blah, 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 selects all of them basically, is probably a select you don't want to do. And then in the show, I'm just using basically a param that is sent over by the request, which grabs the ID, and I find a post in the database that it will send back to the view. So this, in a nutshell, looks all right. Then we could see how the view looks like. So when I'm doing the post listing over here, this one, it could look like this, right? Here at the start, I have post.each. So basically, iterate through this collection, call each one of those a post, and then do what's in between, like till the end, do that to each one of those. Link to post, show path, post. That only means, hey, Rails, create the correct link for me, because I'm too lazy, and I'm, I might do it wrong, so I know you do it right, so go and do that. So it does that with a post title. That will be like the, how do you call it? The string that you see in the link where you can click on. So far, so good. Seems great, right? Anyway, so there's a problem here. Well, actually, no, let's go back, sorry. Let's look at the show. So in the show, basically, when somebody clicked the link, you send the ID over, as we saw in the link, and it will display this page, right? Pretty simple. There's nothing much to it, and it looks great, right? It's very, very simple. This framework is giving us a capacity to build software that's amazing. I mean, if you think about it, you can be really, really quick. Now, obviously, things can start go wrong. Like, for example, a new requirement comes in, and somebody says, hey, we're doing a blog post, this blogging engine, and I'd like people to write some comments, and I want to keep them. I don't want to use something I discuss or anything like that. I want to keep them. All right, so we add that, right? So suddenly you can add comments. Same iteration. I'm not going to go into this detail. But there's a problem there, right? What's the problem in here? So suddenly, I'm calling this comments on post and iterating over them. So you could say, well, that's not too bad, right? Comments is a collection of a type comment, which is linked to a post, and I'm just iterating over them. The problem is, you're actually doing a select. So your view is hitting the database, right? Your view is actually going to the database, fetching all those comments so you can display them. Now, in my world, that doesn't look like a great idea, right? The view should just display things. It shouldn't do anything else. Now, we could fix it, right? What's the easiest fix we can come up with? Here. Right, let's do it here, and then we just send it to the view. Great. That's amazing, right? So what's the problem? Well, that's great, but what's the problem here? So I'm going to go a step forward. So if you think about MVC, what does the pattern actually say? So you've got models, which might or might not be something that connects to the database, but basically are objects that define your business logic, that define your application, define what you're really doing, right? Then you've got controllers, which are a little bit like the judges that go like, oh, I need to go that way. Oh, you need to go that way, right? They're just going and saying where you should go. But apart from that, they should not contain, they shouldn't know anything about the application for real. They are just like knowing where to let it flow, right? And then you've got the views, which are only for display purposes. So the problem here, if you look at this carefully, is that the controllers actually know about the database, right? The controller knows, hey, I've got a thing called post, and I need to select all these rows in the database of this type. Hey, I've got this particular ID, I know it's a post, and I need to find it in the database, right? That's what it's doing here. And that is not right. This is something that, while doing an example this simple, sure. I mean, if I would write the 5-minute blog post, I wouldn't bother, I would do this. Why would I change anything? This is great as it is. But in all reality, our applications are far more complex. I don't know you guys, but the things that we work on for our customers are way more complicated than this. Probably yours too. So who's done big projects with any of these frameworks or others? Right? So when you work on a big project, a really big project, what's the number one issue you will have, not immediately, but very soon? So for example, if you're working with Rails, or any of these actually, it happens less so with Spring because the overhead of actually creating the Spring application to start with is pretty heavy. But if you like Django, Express, Rails, I'm not sure about Cake PHP, I haven't used it myself, Phoenix or Rails, the ramp-up time is very quick. So you start working, in the first few iterations, you move at a speed of light. It's crazy, right? And your customers are like, oh my God, these guys are the best of the world. This is incredible, you know? I need to hire them already for the next project. I don't even know what it is, but I'm going to hire them right now, right? And it's great. It feels amazing. The problem is, if you follow the framework as it is, it will stop you. At some point, your application is more complicated. At some point, you need to do things which are different, right? Because every single application we write is a little bit different, right? It's not exactly as the framework was meant for. I'll take the example of Rails. Why? Because it's pretty known in the world. Rails is a framework built for a company called, or that was called 37 Signals. It's called Basecamp right now. And they only built it for their applications. It solved their problem, right? And it became open source. A lot of people helped, chipped in, and so it became great, right? But it solves their problem. Now, our problems might be different, and I'm sure they are. So when you start using a framework and you start using everything that the framework gives you, it sounds like a great idea to start with, right? But at the end of the day, you realize, well, maybe it's not such a great idea, right? Maybe what I wanted to do wasn't exactly this. So is there a better way? Is there a better way of writing software using a framework? So let's look into that. So I have a little example of an app. It's totally made up, don't worry. So let's suppose we have this controller over here, which defines a purchase order. So to actually do or process a purchase order and display it, literally just display it, I need a contract, and I need to find the purchase order in question. Now, can you spot already something that's wrong here? So the business tells us that there's a purchase order for a contract, and both have IDs and whatnot. So first of all, these things are not linked, right? I find the contract by its ID, and I find the purchase order by its ID, but where's the relationship between these two? It seems not to exist, right? So there's something weird going on there. Let's look at the view for a second, just so you can relate to the post before. So here we see the view, how it could be, right? Totally made up. So you've got this purchase order, you've got here the line items that you're showing, and then at the bottom or on the side, you display the contract. This is the purchase order that relates to this contract, and so on. So the problem, if I go back and forth, the problem between these two is that we've got business logic scattered all over, right? So if we start looking at our applications, especially when you start looking at applications in your frameworks, you realize this. So the gray area, that's your framework, and the blue area, that's your business logic, right? So you've got framework, your logic, framework, your logic. It seems like it's compartmentalized. You've got your business logic scattered all over and mixed in between all your software, which is kind of weird, right? Because suddenly, your business logic is not in one place, which makes it really hard to explain what your application really does, which then leads me to understand, oh, when people talk to me about their software, of course they talk about the framework, because they don't know where the framework starts and where the application finishes. It's all scattered, right? It's all over the place. Now, one of the ways we build software at 8 Light for our customers is we don't do that. We try to take what the application means, the business logic, the core of the application, we put it into a core, the blue part. That's your application. And that is purely the business logic, purely the thing that defines your app, without the framework. There's no controllers there, there's no views, there's no database, there's nothing of such. It's just the core. And at the edges, you will find the framework. So basically the framework, if you think about it, this is my business logic, this is my application, the framework is wrapping around it, right? The framework is actually helping me to bring it to the world as a web application or whatever. But it's only doing that, right? The framework, I will only use it for that particular thing. And why do I do that? Because A, my application will be cleaner. I will not have this mess. And B, don't look at me like that. So my application, Dave is laughing. My application will be cleaner. I won't have all this scatter around. And B, I can change this framework if I wanted to. I can swap things out, which is actually great. Now, do we do it in practice? Not that often. But still, it's a great approach. So just remember, never do that, do this. That. Right? So, how can we change this? We're back here. So we've got this contract, we've got this purchase order, this looks perfect, right? This looks great as it is, but again, it's not following what we just said, right? We are scattering the app all over the place. You've got this thing here, and that's it. So how are we extracting this? What are we going to do this? So the first thing, if you look at this, at the top I put in the directory structure, so we see app controllers. So basically this is a controller, it's over there, and the app. What is the app directory? That's basically a directory used by Rails, where all the things of the framework reside. There's also a directory in Rails called lib. Your framework of choice will have something similar. And in that directory, you can put things that are external to the app. That's how they tell it to you. It's actually things that are external to the framework, right? So if we think, now I'm going to go back to this one, so it's a bit weird. If we think about that, what is external to the framework? Your app. Why? Because it's a core, right? It's totally separated from that. So the lib directory is going to be the directory we're going to use for that. And so the first step we're going to do here is we're going to extract this logic, because we don't want the controller to know, hey, you need to search in the database for a contract. Hey, you need to search in the database for a purchase order. And by the way, my design sucks, so they're not linked together. Right? We don't want people to know this. Right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a purchase order for contract class. It's in the lib directory, and you'll have, this is our CAS application. It's actually an application we're building for this conference. It's not true. You've got like the orders module, and here we're going to define a method called using. Why? I like to build software that reads a little bit like a book. You will see it in a moment. And basically, the only thing that we did, if I go back, we took that part here and just cut it out and put it in there. Yes, copy and paste sometimes. No, don't do it. So we just put it in there. And apart from that, we added at the top, for those of you who don't know Ruby, an attribute reader. So what it means, those two instance variables, one's called contact, the other one called purchase order, are accessible from the outside. So I can say purchase order for contract dot purchase order. It will return those objects, right? But that's the only thing I will know about this thing. So if we now look into the controller and say, so how would this look like in reality? What is the thing? How will it look like? And so here we go. Order. And then you say purchase order for contract using params, the params that came from the request. And that returns this order. Now, I left this here at contract, order.contract, purchase order, order.purchase order. Now, that looks ugly, right? So we've got this piece over there, and then we still got those things, which is kind of weird. Because suddenly, I'm also saying, hey, so I'm going to give you the params. I know that I need to call this thing. Here are the params. I don't know what you're going to do with them, right? Mr. Purchase Order for Contract, I have no idea how you're going to use these parameters, but I'm going to give them to you, and you're going to return an object, which I will call an order. But I know that it has a contract, and I know it has a purchase order. Huh. Again, we're mixing things together, right? And that's a bummer, because we solved a little bit of a problem, but we added another problem, right? Now, at least we got rid of the part where we say, well, it doesn't need to know about the database, correct? Because purchase order from contract could get it from anywhere. We don't know what's going on in there, right? Which is great. But we still need to know a little bit more about this thing. So is there a solution to that? And there is. So, I don't have the circle anymore. I don't want to go that back. So if you remember the core of our application, right? And only at the edges we have our framework. So what do we do? So what is the thing we want to do? What's the thing that happens after this? So after this, we're going to call a view, right? And the view is going to render this information as we saw before, which is great. But we need to know about the objects that the view should know about, right? Which isn't great. So what does a view do if you think about it? What does a view actually do? It presents data to the user, right? It's just presenting the data. So, and that as a clue, right? Presenting data. That's exactly a magical word there which you can use. So you introduce something called a presenter. So this is the purchase order presenter, which takes an order. It will take an order and will be capable of presenting this data. I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can imagine how it's done. It's basically going to provide the objects and the values to create your HTML, etc., or help the view to create it, not really having the HTML, but basically having everything that the view will need to present this data, which is the right spot where it should be. And the nice thing, if you start looking at this and we go to the controller, suddenly it looks like this. I almost inlined it, but it was a little bit too long. Because Pierre basically is saying, hey, I want a new purchase order presenter with the purchase order for contract using the parameters. That's what I need you to present to the view. So, which are the benefits of an approach like this? First of all, you've got a logical separation of concerns. I wrote that down because it sounded very enterprisey. What it actually means is that you're separating all the logic in the lib directory into its own directories, which will be very easy to find. Because if I want to search for this, for these guys, where are they going to be? So if you look there, it's in lib orders. Why? Because they have to do with orders. Where else would they be, right? So if you look into your lib directory, you will see all these directories which basically contain the logical components that will be in there, which is amazing. As a developer, I can see that. I can look into the lib directory and know exactly what I'm looking at. If I see an error somewhere, I can find it immediately, right? Second, and actually super important if you develop software professionally, is the speed of testing, right? My tests are incredibly fast. And why is that? Obviously, lots of you haven't used Rails, But when you run unit tests on Rails, it will boot up the whole Rails ecosystem first and then run the tests, which is awful. Trust me, it is a nightmare. You know, when you see this project, this framework projects, and it's like, oh God, should I go for a coffee? You know, maybe not. It's just a minute too short. Damn it, right? But if you do this, if you separate this out, you're not linked to the framework anymore, right? So your tests are fast. And when I say fast, it's way sub-second. It's milliseconds or even faster. It's really great to watch. And then the tests that you do need to do at the level of a controller are also very easy. Because if you test it out, I'm going to go back again, if you tested out these two things properly, the test for the controller just needs to make sure that these things were called and nothing else, because they are tested already, right? You don't need to care about those things, which makes this test also fast, right? So you've got a lot of benefits over there. Then the clarity of the application purpose becomes pretty obvious, right? Because you look at the application, you see the lib directory, you see the things the application actually does, right? It's there, name by name, right? It handles purchase orders. It does authentication. You know, it does all these things that you can see. It's related to the oil industry and so on, or mining, as we heard before. You know, it's related to all these things, and you can read it there. Obviously, in the test, you can read it even better. But it gives you this clarity inside of your directories. It also gives you a really great clarity of the structure of your application, because you know, like when you're talking about a Rails application, you know in the app directory, I only have things that are related to the framework. My app isn't there. And in my lib directory, there's where my app is. There, everything that's contained in there is my application and nothing else. And this was everything. I was speeding up a little bit because we were running out of time. It already was shifted. So if you've got any questions, shoot. So the question was, you have not removed a dependency that you have in active record in your lib directory. You just moved it into the lib directory, and you're still dependent on Rails. It's partially true. It's partially untrue. I'm dependent on active record. So in Rails, you can boot up things and switch them off as well. And you can use active record outside of Rails as well. And this was just an example, because you could use whichever SQL ORM that you want to use in all reality. The fact that it's hidden is the important fact, because I can switch it, right? I can use SQL, I can use any other library that I think it's better or not. And that's the advantage that you have over there. It's not visible to anybody outside. Any other question? Right, so the question was, or rather the thing he found out, or the feedback, we're creating the presenter only because we're using a framework, right? More or less, that's... So, are we though? I would say no. If I build an application with a lightweight framework or a library, or if I would create my own web server, which is actually one of the tasks our apprentices get, I would still do it. Because I don't want the view to know anything about the domain model first. I don't want the view to know anything about the database. And I don't want the view to have the capacity of actually searching things in the database and doing stuff in the database, right? So I'm offering the view this object which only contains the things that a view can and will use, and nothing else, right? For example, there's a lot of cases where you've got like a date object, right? And date objects, to format date objects to look humanely readable is always like a little bit of a nightmare, right? It's not really a nightmare, but it's fiddly, right? And the problem there is that you will have that fiddle in the view. Whereas in the presenter, I can say, give me this formatted date. Like, give me the date as I want it. right? And it will return it. And I can fiddle there. I won't fiddle in the view. The view just uses these things. Okay, so the struggle is having it in the lib with the orders. Yes. There's another approach. Actually, we do both. I just put it in there as lib orders. You will find in projects that we do for our customers, you will either see it, for example, in lib orders or lib presenters. You know, you can have that too. I prefer to putting those things together. I'm an old Lisper, so I want data and things scrambled together. So I like to see that way. But yes, obviously you can. Do we have time for another question? Oh, perfect. Microphone even. Any other question? Scanning. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Just remember one thing. Anybody can be cool. Using framework is cool. But if you want to be awesome, you need a lot of practice. Thank you.